The Vietnam War. For almost 20 years, it was this defining conflict of the Cold War. It was a brutal civil war, but one fueled by global superpowers. And honestly, a traumatic chapter that would completely reshape nations and redefine how we even see conflict itself. To really get it, we have to start not with the politics, but with the people.
But before we get into any of the politics, the battles, the big decisions, I think it's absolutely crucial to start right here, with the human cost. This number, over 2 million, that's the estimated number of Vietnamese civilians who lost their lives. It's a staggering figure, and it really underscores the profound tragedy at the very heart of this story.
So in this explainer, we're going to break down this incredibly complex history into 6 key parts. First, we'll look at how this nation became so divided. Then we'll see how America got involved, and we'll chart the escalation into this brutal stalemate. After that, we'll dive into the pivotal year of 1968, follow the long road to withdraw, and finally, try to grapple with the war's painful and lasting legacy.
Okay, so where did this all even begin? Well, the roots of this conflict, they go way back to the end of World War II and the final collapse of an old colonial empire. So picture this. Japan's just been defeated in 1945, and a nationalist leader, Ho Chi Minh, declares an independent Vietnam. But France, they weren't ready to just let go of their colony. That sparked the First Indochina War, and after a long, grueling fight, the French were handed this just stunning defeat at Dien Bien Phu. This loss forced everyone to the negotiating table, leading to the Geneva Accords, which officially ended French rule, but split Vietnam right in two.
So this division was drawn at what's called the 17th parallel. In the north, you had a communist state led by Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi, and they were backed by the Soviet Union in China. And in the south, you had a capitalist state led by the fiercely anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem in Saigon, who is heavily supported by the United States. This artificial line drawn in the sand, well, it set the stage for a massive collision of ideologies.
And that collision brings us to the next crucial player in this whole thing, the United States. For Washington, Vietnam wasn't just some local conflict. No, it was a front line in the global Cold War.
And the driving force behind U.S. policy was this one core concept, the domino theory. In the high-stakes chess match of the Cold War, the idea was actually pretty simple, but it was also terrifying. The belief was that if South Vietnam fell to communism, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, the rest of the region would just inevitably follow, one after the other. And so, preventing that first domino from tipping over became an absolute cornerstone of American foreign policy.
Meanwhile, back in Vietnam, the situation was just getting worse and worse. There was supposed to be a big election in 1956 to reunite the country, but it got canceled, mostly because the U.S. and South Vietnam were pretty sure Ho Chi Minh would win. Diem's government in the South became more and more corrupt and authoritarian, and it just alienated its own people. So in response, communist sympathizers down in the South organized a guerrilla resistance movement. They were known as the Viet Cong, and they soon started getting weapons and supplies from the North through this hidden network of trails called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. A civil war was now basically inevitable.
So what started out as just support and maybe some advisory roles for the U.S., well, it would soon spiral into full-blown military intervention, pulling America deeper and deeper and deeper into what became a deadly quagmire.
The real tipping point came in August of 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This was a reported attack on a U.S. warship by North Vietnamese boats. Now, parts of this event are still disputed to this day, but it gave President Lyndon Johnson the political cover he needed. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which basically gave him broad authority to use military force. And by March of '65, the U.S. had launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained, massive bombing campaign against the North, and the first American combat troops were on the ground.
And the escalation, wow, it was both rapid and massive. From just a few thousand advisors in the early 60s, the number of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam just swelled to over 500,000 by 1968. This right here is so key to understanding the war. It was a fundamental clash in military strategy. The U.S. relied on conventional warfare, overwhelming firepower, air superiority, helicopter mobility, the whole shebang. But the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, they perfected guerrilla warfare. They used ambushes, booby traps, and these vast, incredible tunnel networks. And this huge tactical mismatch meant that all of America's technological dominance never ever translated into an easy victory.
For years, the American public kept being told there was light at the end of the tunnel, but 1968, Well, 1968 would extinguish that light and change the course of the war forever.
This quote from Ho Chi Minh really turned out to be prophetic, didn't it? The North Vietnamese strategy was never to defeat the United States in some big conventional battle. No way. It was a war of attrition. They believed they could absorb immense, horrific losses and simply outlast the political will of a foreign superpower.
And in 1968, that will was tested like never before. The year began with the Tet Offensive, a shocking coordinated attack on cities all across South Vietnam. I mean, even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon was assaulted. At the exact same time, a brutal siege was underway at the Marine base of Khe Sanh. And, though it wasn't revealed to the public until the next year, in March, American soldiers committed a horrific massacre of unarmed civilians in a village called My Lai.
Militarily, you could say the Tet Offensive was a failure for the Viet Cong. They were beaten back with just devastating losses. But psychologically, oh, it was a stunning victory. It completely shattered the narrative that the U.S. was winning. Americans, seeing this intense fighting on their television screens every night, began to ask a really simple question. If we're so close to victory, how could this possibly happen? Public support for the war just plummeted.
So after the shocks of 1968, the goal for the United States really wasn't about winning the war anymore. It was about finding a way out without having to admit defeat. President Richard Nixon's new strategy got a name: Vietnamization. The plan was pretty straightforward on the surface. Build up the South Vietnamese army so it could defend itself, which would then allow American troops to gradually come home. The goal was to shift the burden of the combat, leaving the fighting and the dying to the Vietnamese themselves. Nixon's approach, though, it had multiple tracks. Yeah, he began withdrawing U.S. troops, and he kept up air support for the South. But at the very same time, he secretly expanded the war, authorizing these massive bombing campaigns in neighboring Cambodia and Laos to try and disrupt enemy supply lines. This whole complex and very controversial strategy was all aimed at forcing North Vietnam to the negotiating table in Paris. And eventually, it led to this moment. In January 1973, all the parties signed the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement called for a ceasefire and a complete withdrawal of all U.S. troops. So for America, the war was officially over. But for the Vietnamese, the fighting was about to enter its final and most decisive chapter.
The last American soldiers left Vietnam in March of '73, but the consequences of those 2 decades of conflict, well, they would echo for generations, leaving these deep, deep scars on everyone who was involved.
These numbers, they reveal the horrific scale of the bloodshed. Over 58,000 Americans died. The South Vietnamese army lost around 250,000 soldiers. But the losses for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were just immense, exceeding 1 million people. And then, dwarfing all of that is the death toll for civilians, a number so large it's really hard to truly comprehend.
And the war's aftermath was just devastating and so far-reaching. Without U.S. support, South Vietnam fell in April of 1975, and the country was unified under communist rule. The conflict destabilized the entire region, leading to communist takeovers in Laos and, of course, the horrific Cambodian genocide under the Khmer Rouge. And back in America, the war left this legacy of distrust in the government, a deep-seated reluctance to get involved in foreign conflicts, what became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, and it forever changed the relationship between the media, the public, and the government during wartime.
In all of this, it leaves us with a really profound question. The physical fighting, sure, it may have ended in 1975, but the psychological, the environmental, the political wounds, they remain. It really forces us to reflect on how nations heal, how memory gets passed down, and what lessons we carry forward from one of the 20th century's most tragic conflicts.